everyone discovering home recording at this point and it being available, I think they will stretch their own limits, but with equal importance, they will find their own limits. They'll be looking at it going, oh, that's why I let my friend of mine do this one part of the job, or, oh my God, what a real drummer would do for this.
Sure.
Or, I really like all the ideas I got, but recording is new to me. I don't know how to get the sound the way I want.
Right.
So I think that is going to be what happens next year.
Mm.
I was just going to say, I imagine a lot of people who haven't even made records in a while suddenly find themselves with these little folders full of unnamed things.
What did I do here? Yeah. On that tip of I started this, but I don't know how to get it to sound like I hear it in my head. Let's talk a little bit about Circles and how you came to meet Mac. Tell me how you first came to meet him.
I met him in passing and thought he was a very, very nice guy. And later, I got a call from Lenny Waronker. And he just said, hey, there's this really talented kid. And he doesn't say that very often, to his credit. There's a propensity.
The last honest man in music.
Yeah, well, there's a propensity in the A&R gig. Whenever somebody sends you a little one paragraph thing about somebody they want you to work with, they mention that they're a genius. And, which is a pretty big setup. I'm hoping for stuff about the Higgs boson or Da Vinci's notebooks or something. And, it's some demos that sound like just about everybody else. There are certain people, Tim, Dan McCarroll, Jeff Sosno worked on this project. They're all people you can believe if they call and say something is out of the ordinary.
Sure.
And I just met him and thought he was sweet. Honestly, yeah. That was what I personally knew.
Mm.
And Lenny asked if he could visit. And so he came by here and was nice as can be. And I said, well, what are you up to? And it very much was something where he had started at home or would visit studios, putting together tracks. And he very nervously played me some things because they weren't straight hip hop, which also I think is why I came here. He was unsure of the best way to take it further. Making beats for other people was something he was extremely good at and wasn't looking for new knowledge about. And he just started playing these song-based things, and I was utterly knocked out. I was also totally charmed by him because he was very, very funny, very personable, in a real way, not in a salesmanship, let me own the room bullshit kind of way. And clearly had a lot of intelligence, but the tracks were an utter surprise to me, and it woke me up quickly.
Can you describe what is it that surprised you?
That's all right.
I'm guessing you didn't have expectations, but what surprised you about it?
What surprised me is that I looked up some stuff before he came, and was really good. And I'm like, oh, he's got skills and he obviously is interested in record making. So, you know, I knew he was serious, but none of the other stuff was, say, you know, songwriter based. And, you know, to quote, what was it? Philadelphia Story. That was the blank, unholy surprise of it. You know, suddenly there are these, you know, like piano-based songs or these things that it sounded like they could have been almost backracky or something, you know. Though, quite honestly, he wasn't aware of a lot of that stuff. I would mention certain things to him thinking they would be touchstones, and he was just coming to this naturally. He was playing chord changes that interested him. He was always good lyrically, and he was allowing there to be more melody, but he was clearly nervous about singing. Not so much an insecurity about it, like a lot of official singers have, but a perception insecurity, you know? Would this be looked at as dropping the ball?
Right. That other people would somehow criticize his singing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or for not doing straight hip hop. You know, it's okay to have a melody in the chorus, but, you know, verses aren't for that.
Right.
And the thing is, he did both naturally. And I also talked to him about the fact that, well, I didn't like that hip hop had gotten so codified that it was like, well, by the late 90s, everybody had copied the Nirvana model of your verse is the place where you play quiet without your distortion pedal on. Then you scream the chorus and you hit the distortion pedal. And each person who did it got to feel like a rebel. And in hip hop, it became, okay, we can have a chorus that's sung and repeated, but the verse is where we prove it's hip hop. And all the first people who did this in the 90s as well, that was a new thing. For that to be the continuing phenomenon, I've had this feeling that, you know, the great rappers have a sense of phrasing, musical intonation, and the sense of the shape that's made in the pitches changing in the lyrics. And I always felt that, you know, some people would occasionally go into a bit of melody, or some people in the chorus would go into a bit of speaking. And I talked to Mac about the fact that I thought the future would involve more of a marriage between the two the whole time, where just like original hip hop or songwriting, you started the song and it was an outgrowth of one feeling, of one style, of one idea, and that it should be going back and forth between the two organically. And he had that ability, and he started working on stuff that did that. And some of that ended up on Swimming. And, you know, we're working on tracks together, but there was always this batch of stuff. And he was a little more nervous about it because they were just his first batch of songs. No excuses, just nice.
What did he tell you about those songs? What did he say about them?
Not a ton, which is part of knowing that there was a nerviness there. He was more inclined to talk about the hip hop stuff, the dance stuff, his knowledge thereof. With the songs, he had more questions than statements to make about them. And so I'm not going to put words in his mouth. I'm just going to give you the sense of what it was to be in the room.
Sure.
I mean, here is a verbatim quote. This is how much would be said about the song-based material. Is that okay?
Huh.
That's our big conversation.
Yeah.
And I would look at him directly and go, yeah, it is.
Because I'm very much interested in how in whatever it is you did, and maybe it was nonverbal, how you helped him bridge the gap, if you will, from rap to songs.
He had made the jump privately. You know, we could talk about making hybrid stuff in the future, stuff that was started with that intention. And that was part of what was in his head. With the song-based stuff, he knew he wanted it to sound better. But for instance, maybe he had played drums and he had looped a section of the performance, had some other little spots he played some things, but didn't like the way they sounded. And I'd say, hey, I like that performance. I actually think it's great. I just think it should sound better. And I talked to him about ways we could do that. Like instead of, I don't know, just adding a bunch of compression or adding a bunch of stock samples, said, you know, I'll learn to play along with it. And then with Pro Tools, we'll move the new well-recorded drums to your performance and keep your drums in there as part of the sound, and then it'll make one new thing. And I played him some examples of doing this in the past, and he was very turned on by that idea. And so it became things like that. He didn't know where to take the songs beyond where he had the basic instruments, a basic overdub or two. The writing was good. But in instruments he played, he didn't have knowledge of that style of engineering yet. So that became more a topic of conversation than philosophically discussing his work with him.
And I'm wondering, as you were going through this, how did you see the working relationship between the two of you kind of change in the course of working with him? Did he open up further the more perhaps that he got comfortable with the collaboration?
Absolutely. But I think he actually came in pretty open and interested. In other words, this was stuff he kind of had to work on of his own volition up to that point. I think he knew he liked it. You know, even asking a question like, is it okay? You know, he's asking in a songwriting sense. Is that a record? You know, is it good enough to be a record? And my assuring him that philosophically it was there, and that the tonal things could be fixed with just a bit of, you know, attention. And he also, on that stuff, very much wanted me to go to town, as it were. You know, as he learned to play the chords, he'd come up with a bass and a drum part, and he wanted more. But I think it's often tough in this era. People don't necessarily know how to play over stuff that has chord changes. And it's sort of neither here nor there. That's not a good or bad thing. It's just what's typical for the time. It's not typical for people in my time to say, understand what big band arranging was. You know, it wasn't required of you.
Right.
But for me, I love that sort of stuff. So it was fun. And he was often encouraging me to play keyboards or guitar or some other weird instrument I brought in. If he recognized something from a soundtrack, he'd get very, very excited. It's like, oh, that's what that sound is. I'm like, yes. Our conversations were much more basic and immediate. The intense philosophical stuff was usually shared with a look. You know, I'd hear a line of lyric that was obviously not just there to fill space.
Mm.
And I'd look over at him and he'd kind of look away for a second, look down at the floor, and he'd go, those were the philosophical exchanges. You know, a line of lyric that would kill you or was original, and I'd just shoot him a look. And, you know, the understanding of that stuff was there. The conversations were usually about, what is an instrument that could go on here? And I'd say, well, are you looking for this to sound like something that was around previously, or do you want it to sound like something someone can't place? So we'd have that conversation, and I'd pull a few things in, and he'd say which one he liked and didn't, and the one he liked, I'd play. And the rest of the time, we're usually just joking about all manner of inane stuff. We spend most of our time laughing, and then I'd play some dumb keyboard.
But on that tip, I read where you would play, and you would sit down and play an instrument, and you would wait to see his, and this is a quote, his physiology change.
Yeah.
And for a layperson, explain that change. What were you looking for?
I've gotten used to this from watching film directors. So think about the situation of a film director. They come into a room with a thing that's been in full production for a year. You haven't seen it. The year before production, they were working on tidying up the script. The year before that, they were working on the ideas for it. They are 3 years deep into a thing with only 3 to 6 months left before it leaves to the world. And they're sitting this far away from you, looking at a screen with their baby, trying to be cool while watching you out of the side of their eye for a reaction, while trying not to be noticed. And, you play a chord over a certain moment, and if it throws them, you're likely to see, which means, uh-oh. Okay. No diminished chords in this movie. You can play something and suddenly they do this on their chair, just like, and lean towards their own movie. They physically lean into their own thing. So those are two quick examples. Performers know this from the sound of their audience, even if they can't see their faces. They know the feeling when the room changes.
Yeah.
So one of the things I'm very grateful for being a sideman is that I got to watch the situations essentially as an involved outsider. I wasn't the artist, I wasn't the producer. And I got to watch situations in the studio that either went well or didn't. I got to see when there was a disagreement between people and it somehow wasn't getting solved. And as an outsider, started learning like, oh, I think the songwriter doesn't like this thing not being rough enough, you know. Producer doesn't like having to have talks with the songwriter about what they're doing. Oh, I can tell the producer's trying to get a certain type of fidelity. Well, I can make something without fidelity, but play really loose. And could suddenly see two people who were not necessarily getting on 15 minutes previous kind of cool out and get the track. All these things informed me. And so they've been taken into everything I do.
Yeah.
But it's like a life thing. You notice when just you're at dinner with friends. I mean, mind you, this is before the plague. But, you know, pre-plague, we used to do things like, you know, have a dinner and there'd be 4 people at the table. Everybody knows the feeling when a subject has come up and the feeling at the table changes, good or bad. Everyone knows that. And subconsciously, we pick up on all of those things. Sometimes it's physiological. It's often just an eyebrow raise when you look at the person who you think gets it in general. And the two of you look at each other and go, okay, we're gonna sit this one out, and if it turns into a fire, we'll put it out. You know, ixnay on the object say, you know, yeah, the tacos for me, thank you. You just start to get a sense of that. And what I generally try to encourage people to do after the first few meetings is tell them, hey, it's better if you just say it. In creative environment, it's tough for musicians because often people are in bands, and if they say they don't like somebody's part, it might be a 4-week standoff of passive aggressive behavior. And they weren't actually saying anything bad about the person. They just wanted to hear a different part.
Right. Right.
Directors, for instance, they're used to being in control of everything and having knowledge of everything for real, but are afraid when working with musicians, if they use the wrong terminology, they're then going to get a bad result and it's going to hurt their movie. And I just often tell people, don't use musical terms. You don't need to know specifically what I'm doing. Tell me if you like it or not. And if you can, it'll be even more helpful if you say why you like it or not. And they don't have to say anything about music. Hey, I like this. It makes me notice this part of the story. That's great. I can extrapolate from that what to do in the future. And when they say why they don't like something, you know what? It puts me in the mind of, and they give an example. I now know what to avoid. So there was some of that with Mac that could be incredibly simple. And again, nonverbal. If I was sitting playing a keyboard, the difference between, oh, come on, let's face it, it's just a life thing. The difference between somebody who's actually excited and confronted with something they're not used to seeing and are happy about, that's a giant difference. If you put an instrument in front of somebody they didn't even know existed and they make Kid at Christmas face, you know, that is a giant physiological difference.
Got it.
You know, the shoulders tensing up, that's a major thing in, you know, creative collaboration.
Yeah.
But really, most of it isn't that subtle. Somebody isn't very interested, you know, you can see their mind drifting. You can see them looking around at other things in the room or just getting on their phone.
Yeah.
It's real obvious if
How
it's
much?
not exciting people.
Yeah. How much? As you were working with him on the material for Swimming, how aware were you about the ideas he had for the next project? Like what was coming after Swimming?
Well, I'd say very, but to some extent, you know, we didn't have to talk about it as much. You know, there was this sense of, was it okay to just be a songwriter? And, you know, I think that was very much still in play in his mind towards the end.
That he wasn't sure.
Absolutely not. I think he was nervous about doing songs where he was just singing. Was it going to be looked at as terribly uncool? Was it going to be looked at as terribly old-fashioned? And some of it was old-fashioned musically, which was part of the surprise factor. And some of it was very modernistic. Some of it was more modernistic than your average singer-songwriter because he was interested in hip-hop and dance music and absorbed in it. But this didn't have that thing. It's been prevalent for about 20 years, which is people add an element from hip-hop or dance music to what they already do, and they call it a hybrid. There's a drum loop on it. I invited a rapper to, you know, to spit on the bridge. That's not an organic, like, new piece of DNA from two parents. You know, it's not that. It's we're grafting on a little bit of something and what we're presenting to the world to look creative.
Yeah.
So I felt there was newness in his songwriting. Like I liked the fact that the verses would have this spilling, sort of tumbling quality. It was not exact metered verse. You know, it's not the 1920s songwriting model, which I love. But where people are very tight sibyllically. And one of the nice things about hip hop is that the rhyme scheme could change within one verse. If somebody suddenly has, you know, 8 rhymes in a row they want to say, and it breaks up the meter, but it sounds beautiful, everything's okay. Sure. And he sort of brought that to the songwriting thing, and it was natural because it was true to him. And I like that because I could hear both things naturally in it. So let's just say that put me in a very receptive, I'm sure I looked very happy hearing this stuff.
Yeah. One of the things that happened to me as a listener when I listen to Circles is I feel as though I am stepping into a sonic universe. But in a way that it just strikes me differently than a lot of things I've heard. And how much of that sonic universe with Circles in particular was completed before he passed away?
The talks about it were completed. The ideas were on the table. He had started all the tracks. But like I said, because they were him playing real instruments, he did not know engineering-wise how to extend it. Like he would talk about the low end. He'd ask me how I actually got low end. And I'd talk about Greg Kohler, the engineer I work with, and all the experiments we had done. And I showed him, all the things in the signal chain where you could be thinking you're adding bottom and really you're adding low mid-range. You're adding a little boom, which that singable stuff is not low end. The low end stuff you're hearing with your body, quite literally. Just like we have cilia in our ears, there are hairs on your arm, and when the airwaves move past you, your brain is taking a picture of that wave moving past. And most people don't realize, even if they bought cool, expensive old gear, if you run through 3 things that each take off a little bit of the bottom octave of the record, it's gone forever. Doesn't matter if you spent thousands of dollars on some cool thing you saw a picture of from a record you liked. Doesn't matter at all. So he was full of questions about how you got the sonics, and I told him that I was sort of years into looking at that and liked it, and that I often looked at, well, this has been true for me for a long time. I look at multi-track record making as arranging, the same way people would look at a musical score. And the only difference is, besides it just being some creation like from your head, because it's recording, I mean, the very essence and definition of recording is space and time is moving in one direction, and thanks to Edison, we figured out how to capture a bit of that and replay it. And even Edison at the end of his life said it was his favorite invention above all the others. And in multi-track recording, we are getting to take multiple pieces of space and time of actual human events put together collectively in the form somebody would score something. So it contains, intention, improvisation, and the Webster's Dictionary version of music, which is still my favorite. It just says organized sound. And that's the most poetic definition I've heard.
Yeah.
And also really, really accurate. So the sonic universe, like there were a few things where he said, yeah, I know the song's good. And I tell him what I liked about his playing. And he was like, yeah, I think I like that too, but I don't know what else should go on this one. And I think you should go crazy. And I would start putting some things on, and he was a fan of me doing that. So we had already started that process. We were overdubbing like crazy on this stuff. And what would happen is, because we were working in a small studio, I said, when the time comes, we're going to go to a big place. And it was either going to be Ocean Way or United now, and go there or go over to Abbey Road and park to do all the things that required having a big room to do room miking. I talked to him a lot about that, and about that being the thing that nobody knew about or bothered to do anymore. The only time people use room miking on records is to put a pair of mics up when they're tracking drums somewhere and overcompress it and pat themselves on the back, and that's it. Honestly, that is it. If they do a string section, somebody remembers to put up a pair of room mics, and they're mixed into a bounce, and then they're put behind a keyboard sample, and they're only turned on in the outro of the record. Really, this is what we have. So I had talks with him and just said, there's stuff we can do. Instead of me doubling this keyboard part with another keyboard, let me double it on xylophone and marimba. And I want to do it in a room. And I want the room mics to be far enough back that the room time is copacetic with the tempo. And he was into that stuff. So as we were working, I'd maybe be putting down basic keyboard sounds and go, I've got an idea for how to approach the final version of this. You know, and I'd maybe talk about how early 60s records were done when there were actually 30 people in the room. And I'll set up the room so that the room mics are positioned, and then I'll maybe go to each station. Say it's marimba vibes, xylophone, timpani, couple of different pianos, all stuff that would be very average on a session here in LA in 1962. And just keeping the room mics fixed in one place and then using multi-tracking to move from each position. Like I would actually physically put the stuff in the position I wanted it to be in the stereo image. So I would discuss all that with them. I mean, one in particular is Hands, which, you know, we just had a quarter note keyboard. I said, let's do a Dr. Dre, like piano sample influence, like bum, 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 bum. Just straight eighth notes going along. But I'll do it this way so that they're ever changing in color. It's not just here's the block for the verse, here's the block for the chorus. So I would play entire passes of the song, even though it's just eighth notes playing the same chord change. I'd play with different dynamics. So when they were all put together, the color would change with sections. And I'd just keep the vocal really loud in my headphones. So that's what gives it its sense of naturalism and largeness. But the fact that I'm committing to, you know, that original notion of like, oh yeah, well, let's just have the real simple 90s hip hop as if we grabbed the piano sample, but arrange it like an early 60s arrangement. Because the song isn't at all that way. So it doesn't come off like it's, you know, there was that spate of people 15 years ago trying to figure out how to make pre-Beatles sounding semi-R&B, and some people were sensational at it, you know, the Dap Kings being probably primary example, and then everyone chased them, chasing that. You know, I wanted to take an aspect of that era of records that I wasn't hearing brought back. And for instance, orchestral percussion. You know, there are all this great early 60s, like the Quincy Jones stuff he did, like on the Leslie Gore song. It'll be like just one xylophone note into a little tape echo and, you know, piccolo or something. Yeah, and it's just great. So I felt like that hadn't been used in a modernized way. So here's why I went into depth there. That's an example of, we had the track, it had a very simple drum pattern. I added some things to it, but I said, look, when we get to the big studio, here's the stuff I'll do. I'll do tiny little pieces of percussion with my hands, and I'll double the kick and snare sound with an actual performance on each in a big room with big room mics. So it's the exact drum pattern we had. You know, he just somehow wanted it to be something other people wouldn't get if they opened up their laptop and started working. So I think everything was an extension of those conversations. How do we get things that people aren't getting by working the way they're working currently. And I think it worked out because, you know, I didn't want to make something strictly old-fashioned. Doing these old-fashioned things was interesting because they would already be hybridized.
Sure.
In a real way.
One of the things that caught my attention, I know that you ultimately, as you were working to finish Circles, you were listening to material that Mac had done by himself. And one of those songs, I believe, was the Arthur Lee track.
Right.
Everybody got a lick, which is, I mean, that is just a terrific choice, just in it, kind of in and of itself. But what did you observe of his interest in that music?
He was full of questions about that era of records. He grew up a Beatle fan, so he knew about that, but he didn't specifically know how it was done. So he was always asking questions about that. But I remember he used to come to the gigs I did in town. And, you know, it's a true story. I saw him the next night, and I was like taking random requests from the audience. And at some point, I think I was leading an audience sing-along of Close to You. And he didn't know it. He was like, what was that song you did? I don't know, I guess it's yours? And he's describing it, and I'm trying to think of what it would be. And then finally I figured out, after we're talking for like 5 minutes and he remembered a bit of lyric, I'm like, that's Close to You. That was a big Carpenters hit. And, you know, you just don't know which things people know about and not. And that actually led to a discussion about, you know, that era of record making, and not just the Carpenters. I said, yeah, that was a really, everybody was singing along because it was a very, very big hit in the early 70s. And it was a school of, you know, pop record making at the time. And so hence he went and looked it up. You know, I saw him 2 days later, and he had listened to other stuff, and I mentioned Backrack to him, and, you know, he didn't know the stuff. It was very fun to turn him on to it. Like, oh, you're interested in songwriting. Well, this Backrack guy's interesting. You like chord changes. Cool.
Yeah. A few good songs.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many parts of me that are crushed in his passing.
Yeah.
And, but I can tell you, one of the things that pains me most, and that will come up, and why my physiology just changed, is he was so good at absorbing information. There was so much I wanted to get to tell him about. And it would be in my head like, oh, you don't know about Backrack? Like, oh my God, wait till I turn you on to Hank Williams and Gershwin and Ellington. You know, and that was literally in my head. This is not a thing I'm making up on the spot. Like, oh my God, this is fantastic. You know the Beatles, and you have this sense that you want records to not feel quite like they're feeling right now, but you still want to make modern music. I mean, he was speaking my language. I was so thrilled. Like, yes, let's make modern music that has humanistic elements to it. We've had this horrible thing, and it started with 50s sci-fi movies, that the future is robotic. And now I feel like that endlessly, that's, you know, the sort of synth or vocoder thing is a representation of the future. It's like an old idea of the future. It's as funny as the World of Tomorrow in 1939 World's Fair exhibitions.
Yeah.
And if we're going to be around in the future, there are going to be humans in the future. There might be human sounds, and they're going to be integrated just as we are. We're having this conversation in that manner of integrating with technology. Satellites are doing their part, but the content is human.
Mm.
So as a human, my experience with him was he absorbed information quickly. I think he was brilliant. And I couldn't wait to tell him about this history of human information that was part of the subject he was interested in. Like, oh, you're interested in lyrics. Oh my God. Do you know about this poet? Probably didn't. And it probably would have, you know, absolutely made his, you know, mind go boom, or a particular philosopher, and just go, hey, this is all part of the same job. I have a love of songs as a form of condensed information, and that songs themselves are already a multimedia experience. That's my own personal belief. And I still feel there's a place for record making, because again, by definition of the word record, of something being a record of something, has to be a record of information. And so people are making records all the time, you know, they're blogging about something. It's a record of their opinion at that moment. And just like that, they're going to discover what a lot of musicians already know. Ooh, I wish I hadn't put out all my early recordings. I'd like a do-over.
Let me ask you that. As you were working to complete Circles, was there an operating philosophy, something that you kept in mind that helped guide you?
Yeah. I wanted to do well by him. And when I met with the family and they asked me to see it through, I remember their faces. That's it.
Hmm.
And that was the constant reminder. It was three-dimensionally frozen in my psyche. And as much as I am me, I had my sense of what Mac was. We had the conversations we did. I heard what I heard. I wanted them to hear their kid in the best light possible. I wanted to do the best job for the things Mac was nervous about, in terms of, is it okay that I'm just doing these songs where I'm singing? And to try and not have it just be the strictly old-fashioned sounding. So it's like, oh, you want to do old-fashioned stuff. I mean, those are things we talked about with me each day. And there was just a constant checking and rechecking. I knew that I was going to want the vocal as loud as, you know, possible. I knew I would want to measure everything against that. And I knew I would want to work to get as much richness around that. And by that, I mean the sense of richness, not necessarily amount of stuff. You know, if there are three elements, I want them to sound as nice as possible, and I want them to be a good setting for the vocal, or offset, or even a catapult in cases, if possible. And so the vocal was always kept very loud while I was working. And in general, that's true when I work. But in this case, it was more painful.
Yeah.
I got to tell you, it's not, I don't recommend the job.
Mm.
Do you want to watch moving images of a person you lost, like on repeat as your job every day? The thoughts about the things I wanted to tell him came to me more and more and more as I worked. Like, oh my God, this kid would have loved whatever thing, a subject, a type of music. He also was up to the task, and this is where my real excitement was, of me suggesting, hey, nobody's done this yet. Nobody's put these two or three things together in a natural and direct way. He was the sort of person you could feed the information into, and his ability intellectually as an improviser was spot on. It was fantastic.
Well,
So he would have done it.
We're running down on time, and all I can say is,
aren't we all?
Well, yeah, in some sense. But I mean, I would dearly love to do part two of this. But let me throw this last question at you, and I think you would understand perhaps better than many people I talk to, that the art of music making and making records is so much about collaboration and about the ability for those who are working together to actually work together and connect sometimes at levels that can't be explained. Why did from your perspective, why did your collaboration with Mac work so well?
I think we liked each other. I think that's the heart of it. I thought the work was good that he walked in the door with. I had fun every day we worked, and I felt that when we both threw our 2 cents in, including saying what we both disliked, you know, he would occasionally poke his head around the door while I was playing and go, I'm not crazy about, that aspect. And I go, cool, no problem. And it would generally get better. And likewise, if I told him, when he played me something, I'm like, hey, I don't think you need that element over there. For me, it's getting in the way of the voice. And maybe that's just my opinion, but that annoys me. And here's what it strikes me you were trying to get with that part. And then I'd talk to him. And, did you want something that was surprising or whatever? And he'd go, yes. But that was as much as I could do. I said, okay, in this case, I'm not going to work with that part as a starting part. Let me play until you hear something that has the effect you want, and then we're going to build on that. And we'll make the sound better or whatever. So it worked because of that. I think it worked because we were both opinionated, but had fun. And, and I told him very early on to just say when he didn't like things, that I actually wouldn't take it personally. I'd rather know early. I got to be honest with you, it's much tougher when people are afraid to say that, they act like they like it, and 3 months later, the whole thing gets thrown out because, like, well, I never really liked that one. It's like, hey, you could have saved us both a lot of time. So he didn't have that fault. And he believed me when I said he could just tell me. And because of that, I actually adored the sessions with him. I wish more people had, well, I'm going to say it, that maturity to realize it's better for their own work. And again, I think my time as a session player taught me that. My early gigs as a producer taught me that, but especially when you're young, I think you still personalize things too much. And being a session player was really good. It was in an era when people were still playing with each other. And in the course of 3 days, you could work with 3 different artists, 3 different producers, 3 different types of music. And I'm immensely glad for that experience, because afterwards I was able to introduce those lessons into record making. And more importantly, I think it set me up to be a different sort of film composer. I mean, there are probably 2 elements that go into that. One is that I want to make something different. And when it just sounds average, usually it's somebody else has tried to crowbar averageness into it. Because the approach each day is, what is the way to make the picture come alive, and what is the way to avoid the normal trappings of the gig? And I would say the years as a session player really, really helped. And I think working on films really helped. Something like working with Mac, who could think in terms of images. It's why he was such a good freestyler, why he could improvise lyrics on the spot that were genuinely good. Why it would have been fun to turn him on to certain philosophy things. He would have gotten it quickly. It would have excited his mind, as that stuff is designed to do. I would have loved to have had more time with him and turned him on to just like a few Bach pieces and go, they're designed to make your gears like go top speed. It's great that way, and it's pretty. And with somebody like Mac, I could just say, what's a version like that we could do? What could we make of something where the components themselves make your gears turn? And he would have immediately gone home and started to think about it. So it worked because all of those topics were open for discussion.
Well, all I can tell you is it's a remarkable album.
He was good.
Yeah, when I first listened to it, it set me back. Yeah, I was not expecting what I was ultimately presented with. And certainly you're to be commended for bringing that to fruition.
Well, I'm happy to hear you say that, because that was my experience the first night he came here. Yeah. He started playing that material. I didn't see it coming.
Yeah. Well, Jon Brion, I am so grateful that you took the time tonight to have a chat.
Happy to be here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, man.